G'day. Hope you're enjoying the Sifter showcase. It's been a lot of fun so far, and there's plenty more to enjoy. And right now, we're talking to the team at Gameloft, who are based in Brisbane, talking about a game that they have reimagined. It's called the Oregon Trail. You might have heard of it before. You might have played it. You might have died of dysentery. And joining me now is Rowan Ryder, who's a senior designer, and Cameron Palmer, who's the marketing manager, to talk about how they could reframe, redesign a game that has a special place in a lot of people's hearts. Rowan and Cameron, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for having us.
So this is a game that's got a lot of history, a lot of legacy, but there may well be people out there who've never played the Oregon Trail before. So can you explain to us what the game is and what you've done to bring it into 2021?
Sure. Yep. So the Oregon Trail follows the real life trail of the same name, 19th century America. These immigrants would travel west from Independence in Missouri to Oregon City, or the location of Oregon City. It was a famously dangerous trail, full of wild adventures, crazy stories, strange kind of environments. And the game follows that journey from beginning to end. Famously, there was a 1985 version of the same game released for the Apple II. Almost every American school kid played it, I believe, in the 90s and late 80s. And our game, is a modern reimagining of that game, sort of somewhere between a remake and a spiritual successor.
So tell me a little bit more about those systems that you've built into the game, because I've got memories of, just doing your best, trying your hardest, and crossing your fingers that you wouldn't get wiped out by dysentery at an inopportune time. Can you tell me what have you done to make those events work, and so it feels more like a current contemporary game in 2021?
Sure. So, of course, the original game was our biggest source of inspiration, but it's not contemporary. Essentially, we took a lot of inspiration from modern roguelikes, so things like Slay the Spire and FTL, and we really wanted to make the trail feel dangerous and wild, like the original game did, but without robbing the player of agency. And so we did this through what we call the events system. Essentially, as you're traveling, things will happen to you and your characters. So your gun might go off in your wagon and accidentally shoot one of your characters, or you'll get dysentery, of course, or someone gets run over. Some are positive, but very few. And the player has to react and make choices to these. So in one of those examples, if a character is shot, you may need to decide how to heal them, if it's worth sacrificing resources on them, if you have those resources to spare at all, if it's worth carrying ammunition knowing that it might go off. And then in the back end, we actually have a system that decides which of these events to play based on your progress. So we might say, for example, if the player is doing extremely well, has tons of food, you'll notice some of your food's gone rotten, or it's more likely that some of your food will rot. And in that way, we sort of want to give this roller coaster feel, lots of ups and downs. We didn't want it to feel very flat and random. So we have this kind of smart system that determines what happens, but ultimately it's still up to the player to succeed. We wanted to hit that sweet spot between randomness and player agency.
Can you tell me what you've done to kind of tune those systems in the game? Because I know that in most cases, random events are never actually truly random. They've got a weighting attached to them. What have you done to make sure it doesn't feel too unfair?
Yeah, so the way we weight this system is by essentially tagging each event in a category. So we might say this is a food loss category, or this is a health loss category. And then we look at the player's resources and status. So what they've got, how far along the trail they are, how many characters they have. And then we push each category a certain amount. And then when an event decides to trigger, we pick a category, whichever category has the most of this kind of number behind the scenes, and then we pull a random event out of that category. And so the result is that we roughly determine what will happen. We say the player will probably take damage now, but there's still a good amount of randomness within that idea. So they may take damage depending on player reaction, but the end result is that they usually do mostly what we want with this element of randomness to it.
How does that compare to, I guess, the original game? Because in that, it really just felt like sometimes luck was not in your favor and you were just on a bad run.
Yeah, so the 1985 version for Apple II was designed to be educational, first and foremost. Ours is both educational and entertainment. And in the 1985 version, there didn't seem to be any kind of waiting system. Things would just happen along the trail. So you would lose all your food, someone will get run over, someone will die, and you had choices to make. So you might, for example, you had to cross rivers, which is something that returned in our game. But in the original game, those were kind of all your choices: what to bring, how to cross rivers, and whether or not to ford at the end. Whether or not to raft at the end. And it was, I mean, you can play it now. You can play it for free online. It feels very cruel, which I think was the point of, trying to get this idea across. So we've tried to hit that sweet spot of, being quite punishing, being very serious, but being fair, more fair to the player, and giving them more agency, more control over the outcomes.
Just following up from that as well, we do actually have the different game modes that are on the Oregon Trail. So we also have things such as the nature trail for those who want to take it just a little bit easier, but want to experience what it's like in a bit more of a relaxing sense. And with that one, if I'm not mistaken, I believe it's a lot less negative events. So hopefully less dysentery and being shot by a gun. But you also have ones like Oregon or Bust as well, where it's a lot more true to the original game, where it's very difficult, sort of experiencing what would happen on the trails at those times.
Do you know what a player is actually leaning towards in your game? What sort of gameplay are they attracted to?
Yeah, so players, they seem to tend to be more cautious than I thought they would be, which sounds silly, but you sort of expect players to be a little bit reckless before they understand the systems. They kind of make poor decisions because they're still learning, right? Of course. Players tend to play so carefully that they lose. They're too slow. They stock up too many resources, spend too much money, that kind of thing. And so it's kind of important that as we've updated the game, we've pushed players to be a little bit more reckless and kind of a little bit more adventurous.
I think winter freezing over was one of the more common ones that people tended to fail, was that they were too slow and winter would come by, and unfortunately their run would be over. So it's quite interesting to sort of pick up on that. But
this isn't, of course, the first time that Gameloft has actually tackled this game before. Between 2009 and 2012, you made 4 different versions of the Oregon Trail. And I'm just curious, how does that shape this version of the game, bearing in mind that obviously Gameloft is a big company that's spread all around the world and it's several years since the last one has been made?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. We very early on, right at the beginning of the project, we decided to take inspiration from the most famous version, the 1985 Apple II version of the game. And so we didn't ignore the other Gameloft iterations, but there are so many versions of the Oregon Trail in the world, outside of Gameloft as well. We very specifically focused in on the 1985 version, the very famous, the very big one. And we really wanted to remake that, the one that people remember, especially in the States. And so it's not that we ignored the other Oregon Trail games, but they weren't major sources of inspiration like the original was. Or sorry, not the original, the 1985 version.
There's a bit of nostalgia associated with it as well, and especially for those in America who've grown up with the game and now they look at the modern version. We'll get reviews or looking at comments and people saying, wow, I remember playing this when I was in school type thing. So a lot of that was sort of aimed at, that sort of audience as well.
Can you tell me a little bit more about, I guess, the historical context of this game? Because there is a weighting to it. That historical move of colonists to the west means a lot in the US to a lot of people, and has sometimes got some negative connotations. Can you tell me what an Australian team can bring to that perspective when making a game like the Oregon Trail, and what considerations you had to put in place?
Yeah, look, it's obviously a very delicate subject matter. We worked closely with scholars from HarperCollins to make sure we were representing, especially the Native American perspective, respectfully and accurately as well. As an Australian studio, I remember our first design meeting. This was the first question I asked our director. I said, "Why us?" Seems a bit weird. But truthfully, I think having this level of detachment from nostalgia really helped. I can't obviously speak to what it would be like to develop this as an American, someone who grew up with the game. But from my perspective, it was easy to kind of look at it from the outside and sort of say, well, people remember the 1985 version differently to what it is. If you play it now, it's not that hard, for example, because people played it as kids during a half-hour lunch break and, didn't do well, of course. And that's what they remember, right? And whereas us, we don't have that memory attached, or not all of us, I should say. Some people in the studio have played it when they were younger. But I think having that level of detachment really helped to remake it. Helped to give we already had a modern take on this game just by virtue of not having that nostalgia. So I think that was very helpful.
Yeah,
so, certainly from a design perspective.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I guess, Cameron, from a marketing perspective, how do you sell this game in 2021 if they've already got the context of previous games that they've maybe played throughout their whole history? How do you actually get people to buy it and try out this version?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, from a marketing perspective, it's really useful that people are aware of what the Oregon Trail is. So from a US audience perspective, there was definitely a lot of brand awareness and brand exposure. But yeah, from an Australian perspective, for example, or other perspectives, there was that sort of new take and new spin because most people weren't actually aware of it from other cultures. So yeah, it was definitely interesting to sort of see both sides of the fence and in terms of doing that, also advertise towards it as well.
Can you tell me a little bit more about that journey system you talked about? I know there's sort of multiple pathways through, different storylines, but how do those paths sort of unfold for the player? How do they work?
Yeah, so the journey system was born of a desire to kind of promote different forms of play. The main game is, of course, quite long. It's very difficult, and it's partly an adaptation to being a mobile game. We wanted to give other ways to engage, as well as other ways to tell stories. For example, the main journey is very specifically about 4 settlers heading west to Oregon. But the real life history is very complex, very layered. A lot was going on in this kind of period of history and in these locations. And so the journey system was there to help us branch out, tell more stories, and give players more accessible ways to sort of engage with these stories. And so, for example, we have the Rendezvous is one of our journeys, which was a kind of an annual camp that hunters would meet at and share their stories about hunting. And so we've sort of dramatized this into these really ridiculous stories. And the more ridiculous story the player can tell, the sort of better they do. And we also use this as a way to represent different Native American perspectives, people who weren't immigrants, people who weren't traveling west. So we have quite a few of those there. It's sort of showing the impact of emigration as well. Again, working with our scholars to make it as accurate as possible. So it was a good way to sort of expand the scope of narrative and gameplay, give players more ways to engage, and give the development team more ways to tell stories.
Mm.
You mentioned there that you wanted to have some sort of like roguelite or roguelike elements in it. I think actually the original Oregon Trail probably predates Rogue. But what are some of those lessons that you've learnt from those modern games that you're able to bring into this to make it feel like a modern interpretation of that sort of run-based game?
Yep. So the first thing that jumped out to us in terms of being inspired by roguelikes, I should say roguelites, because there's a difference that will upset a certain group of people. Roguelite is what our game is, and the difference being that you sort of make progress towards something every time you play, even if you're terrible at the game, which a lot of people are, so it's a hard game, right? But we have this, what we call the journal system, and it's full of stuff to do, basically, little achievements, animals to collect, fish to collect. And every time you play, even if you're not very good at the game, you'll be making progress in some meaningful way. That was our biggest source, I think. Similarly, if you make the journey, you start the journey, you don't quite make it there, if you reach certain checkpoints along the way, you can then resume your journey from those checkpoints. Takes the sting out. Your score won't be as high, and you're sort of rewarded for not doing it, but you're not punished for doing it either. It's more accessible. It's a way for people to sort of experience the main game, even if they're not amazing at it.
And I think a good way as well is with certain roguelikes, it's quite renowned that when you play the game and you do die, sometimes they just go, oops, too bad, that's it. In the case of like the Oregon Trail, we want to make it accessible for pretty much everyone. So we've seen comments of parents and their kids playing it. So if they do fail on one of the journeys, you do want to let them know that, hey, look, you didn't make it to the end. This is why. So the next time you play, now you have a bit of an idea on how you can sort of navigate around that.
I should say as well, just before I forget, because it's pretty cool. our party drafting system at the beginning. So in the original game, you would pick your class, a character that represented you as the player, and you wouldn't actually see them in the game. You had a party separate to that. In our version of the Oregon Trail, you select 4 characters that have a class each. So things like physician, adventurer, banker, of course, carpenter, and so on. And then each of these characters has traits. They have 2 traits that sort of determine their personality. So they might be pessimistic and athletic, or they might be heroic but greedy, or whatever. And it really, these traits will then impact what happens on the trail. So, for example, a paranoid character, it sort of sounds bad, right? And they might not do things that are beneficial to the party because they're suspicious, but it might also save them from traps and accidents and things. And that was a big source of our inspiration from roguelites, was that each run is different based on this random roll at the beginning. The player has some choice to influence this roll, but each time there's a different bit of flavor, bit of personality, and inevitably players really inject their own personality onto these characters, especially because they can rename them.
Yeah.
So you get a character that's, sort of dim-witted and messy, and you name it after your friend. It's instantly funny, especially when they die of dysentery and you share the message with them. So that was huge. Yeah, getting that party drafting in was a big point of difference.
Can you tell me what you know about the players who are playing with this game? Because it is an Apple Arcade game. It's different to a free-to-play game. It has a different sort of model to it. What are they interested in? What sort of players are they? What sort of advice would you give to other developers who might have been invited to make a game for Apple Arcade?
It's hard to say, to be honest. For us, I think the Journey system was a bit of a saving grace because it gives players that accessibility to engage with the game how they choose. Similarly, as Cameron mentioned earlier, we have different difficulty modes in 3 different journeys. I think that accessibility is huge. The Oregon Trail in particular is quite difficult, and it takes quite a long time to finish, like the entire thing. It's got a lot of content. And some people love that, of course. Some people want something a bit smaller. So I would say one thing that we did quite well that worked out, and one thing I would encourage other people to do, is to have these different modes of play, different ways to access your game and experience it, simply because it's a huge audience on Apple Arcade. And, if you have a very specific way to play your game, it's only going to please so many people, of course. It's targeted towards a specific subset. So if you can, without harming your vision, I would definitely recommend opening up your game to as much accessible play as possible.
100%, and even adding on to that as well, Apple Arcade is a premium service. So for $5 you can get access to tons and tons and tons of games. So when working on a title for that platform, you're wanting a high quality game. And particularly with the Oregon Trail, we wanted to make it so that it was very story-driven, very interactive, and as Rowan mentioned as well with the achievement system, a lot of replayability. There's a lot of things to collect and do. So you definitely want to feel like you're sort of getting your money's worth out of it as well. So at least from a consumer perspective.
Can you tell me a little bit more about the different versions you had to make of this game? Because, of course, Apple Arcade can be played on a TV, or it could be played on an iPad or a phone, but it also can be played with a keyboard and mouse on a Mac. What are some of the differences between the versions of each release of the Apple Arcade version of Oregon Trail?
Yeah, so it's interesting because our game is very menu-driven. We didn't have to change any of the core gameplay. I shouldn't say any. We didn't have to change much of the core gameplay at all to enable different control schemes. So the Oregon Trail works on every controller supported on Apple Arcade, tvOS controllers, with Siri remote, I should say. Touchscreens, of course, regular gamepads plugged in, keyboard and mouse. But because it's so menu-driven, it's very similar. It did take a lot of work. There's people on the UI team would be very upset to hear me say, it was easy. But from a design perspective, it was easy. It was nothing. Part of it, and this is a consideration for all mobile games, but the Oregon Trail is very text heavy, and it's very easy for that text size to get very small when you're writing massive long sentences. But I think that was never a major problem for us, which I think we have a great UI team who, again, would be very upset to hear me saying any of this, but they managed to solve this problem either by breaking the text up where needed or by shrinking it when necessary. But in terms of supporting multiple platforms, it wasn't really an issue that came up in design.
What aspects of this game are you really proud of, and that when you see people discover them, it really brings a smile to your face?
For me, the thing that I really enjoy seeing players, the thing I really enjoy seeing players experience is when they get really attached to one of their characters, and one or more of their characters, and they see those personality traits come through that we've injected in there. So they see, for example, we have a trait called pugnacious, which is someone who's not great, someone who's very rude and very kind of confronting, and if you go to what's called a celebration campsite, there's a chance that overnight they'll trash the place. They'll have a big party, have a great time. And it's a very low chance, but it's great to see these tweets from people and, posts on Reddit and Discord and whatever, where players have found this and they just go, oh, that's amazing. It's so funny. And we have so many of these little interactions based on traits just scattered throughout the game. And they're quite rare and they're triggered under specific circumstances, but you'll inevitably see one or two, right, per playthrough. I love seeing players come across those and just kind of get excited that it has such a big impact that they just had no idea about, not at first. And there are so many that I think, inevitably players will just keep finding new ones.
100%.
That's it for me, definitely.
I feel like I'm in a similar boat as well. Like, it was like absolutely hilarious to see comments from people being like, well, I started the game and now I've got dysentery. So it's sort of like, yep, you can see that trend going type thing. But it's sort of that serendipitous feeling of seeing the community playing the game and then going like, oh, this is what I loved about it, or this feature's hooking me, and particularly with the journeys, like the story elements of it, dragging people into it, and they're loving that historical nature is absolutely fantastic, and that's something that we love to see here.
I'm just wondering, now that we've had a couple of months since this game has come out, and you've got a lot of things for people to discover. I'm just wondering if there's anything that you wish you had done slightly differently, or that you've kind of responded to audience feedback and sort of changed so that it made the game better for what it is now.
I don't think there's anything I'd want to specifically change, which is rare, right? I'm happy to admit that's quite rare. Once you release a game, you look back at the design. Normally, there are things you go, oh, this could have been done a bit better, this could have been done differently. But in the case of the Oregon Trail, I think it came together really well. I think we really landed on our pillars, our creative pillars. The game's been so well received. And I think for me personally, during development, the big concern was finding that sweet spot between being random and giving the player agency over their journey. I think we got there in the end, but of course, it was a bit touch and go. The last few weeks, we're sort of pulling these levers, going, "Oh, it's too hard. Oh, it's too random. Oh, now it's too easy." And I'm happy we got there in the end. I suppose if I had to change one thing, it would have been to make that process easier somehow. Yeah. But we got there. So no, not personally. There's nothing. I don't think there's anything I would have changed.
Do you chalk that up to, I guess, the game that you are reimagining already having an understood gameplay loop, and you're really just building on top of that?
Yeah, having an existing gameplay loop was hugely helpful. We looked at the original, we said, how can we modernize this? That was our starting point. And one thing that went extremely well through development was that we stuck to that pillar the whole way through. At no point did we have a major shift or any kind of crazy change that was required. And it shines, right? You can see it. You can play it now. You can compare it to the 1985 version, and it's got that same core loop, right? Essentially, if you strip away all this huge amount of work we've done, you can see that it's this core game still. It's the same creative pillar, same core loop. Having that kind of, in a way, it essentially meant we were polishing from day one, at least in terms of design. And absolutely, that was hugely helpful. Just knowing that, having this journey west in which the player has to react to events, we never changed that core. And absolutely, incredibly helpful.
It's been a real pleasure to speak to you both, Cameron Palmer and Rowan Ryder from Gameloft Australia, telling us about the Oregon Trail, which is available on all the Apple devices. It's available through the Apple Arcade. Thank you so much. Appreciate you taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gianni. We really appreciate it.